Week after long, hot week, John F. Kennedy's PT boat squadron went on routine patrols in the Solomons. For some of the men, the Japanese seemed a less formidable enemy than boredom. But naval officer was his first job after college, and he took it seriously. Paul Fay.
Well, it was during that period when I really got to know John Kennedy. He had a tent that he lived in, and we used to go up every evening before dinner, and he would hold a seminar, and we would have had a subject that he gave us the day before that we should more or less brief up on. We'd come up to this meeting about 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and we would sit up there around in his tent, or hut as it was known, and discuss these things and the issues that were involved in the different subjects that he took. A typical example would be what was our feeling relative to how we got into the war. None of us, if we'd had our choice, would have wanted to fight a war. His feeling was we had no right to complain about it unless we planned to do something about it in the future so it wouldn't happen again.
Another friend of his, George Barney Ross, was on his boat one night in August 1943 when it was split in two by a Japanese destroyer.
I was just standing on the dock when Jack comes running down the dock, and the 109 started in to pick him up. And I said, "Do you mind if I come along, Jack?" And he said, "No, come on." He says, "I'm short of man anyway." It was about, just getting dark, just dusk. And this was the normal time for the PT boats to go out, so they would arrive on station just at darkness so the Japanese couldn't spot us from the shore as easily. I hadn't been in on the briefing, so I'm blissfully ignorant of what the purpose of this mass exodus of boats was, which was to intercept these 4 destroyers. It was as dark as if you were in a closet with a door shut. It was that kind of night. It was no moon, no stars. Along about 1 o'clock in the morning, we had temporarily lost contact with the other boat, and we were on one engine. I'd say we were going about 4 or 5 knots, when all of us, more or less at the same time, spotted this white water off the starboard bow. Then we spotted the mast against the sky. That was the sight that I'll never forget. The mast heeling over at about a 45-degree angle toward us, this destroyer mast. Of course, at this distance would probably be maybe 100 feet. Whereas if he hadn't turned, he would have just missed us. But by turning, he caught us on the starboard bow at about a 20-degree angle to the longitudinal center of the boat. So he split the boat sort of long ways, not to cross the boat. He hit up there on the bow at about 5 feet to my right, and it continued on back, completely obliterating the starboard turret, and the boat is at about a 45 or 50-degree angle, and everything seems to be lit up. My first fear was that the Japs had turned on their searchlights and were coming back for us. The light that I'd seen, of course, was a gasoline which went up. Our little group of 3 that was floating out in the darkness, so to speak, in our life jackets. We must have either been hit on the head with something or asphyxiated, I guess you would call it, by the gasoline. The wind was blowing the fire down away from the boat, which I guess saved everybody. As the dawn came up, we found ourselves on the boat with the boat underwater all the way up to the bow. So we're hanging onto the boat, expecting any minute to have the Jap launch come out and take us into custody or whatever they would do to us. By noon, it became apparent that the boat was not going to stay afloat through the night. So rather than have the boat sink on us in the middle of the night, we decided to strike out for land, just someplace that would be dry land and wouldn't have a hostile group of Japs staring at us. Jack took McMahon's life jacket straps, rolled him over on his back, and took the straps in his teeth so that they were sort of back to back. We paddled along all afternoon and made it over to the little island, which Bob Donovan later found out the natives call Plum Pudding. It was only about, I'd say, 100 feet across, circular in shape with bushes around the shoreline, I'd say about 25 trees, and a reef extending out about 200 yards from the beach, quite sharp, and we crawled up in the bushes, and most of us were ready to call it a day. The next thing I know, it's about 8:30 in the evening, and Jack informed us that he was going to swim out in an easterly direction from the island we were on into Ferguson Passage. Ferguson Passage was one of the entrances into Blackett Strait that the PT boats took on their evening patrols. He, of course, had now been in the water since 1 o'clock the previous morning, and all of us tried to persuade him not to do it, but he was determined that if he could just get over there in about an hour's time from now, these boats would be going by, and here would be a chance to get us all out of the soup right away. We were so near and yet so far. He realized, of course, he was tired, and he said, now, if you boys will get out on the reef with the battle lantern, which still worked, and act as a landmark for me, then I'll be able to see it, and I shouldn't be too long. So that was the arrangement, and off he went into the water and struck out for Ferguson Passage. He soon disappeared, and we took up our watch on the reef. We waited and waited and waited all night long, and nobody came. I guess the waves got a little stronger, and he passed out anyway during the night, and that was why he didn't come back. He still had his life jacket, however, so this kept him afloat and his head out of the water. When the morning came, he came to and recognized where he was and made it back to the reef that led into our island. We, of course, had figured he was gone, and our morale was fairly at the bottom at this point. We saw him struggling up the reef. Of course, we were overjoyed and went out and pulled him in. And before he went to sleep, he said, "Barney, you try it tonight," which was great news for me. My trip out to Ferguson Passage proved to be to no avail also. So the next day, we decided to move to an island that had coconut trees on it because we, at this stage of the game, had nothing to drink and nothing to eat. Then Jack and I did a little swimming further toward Ferguson Passage. Over there we found in the bushes a native canoe. We found water in a drum. And we were seen over on this outer island fooling around with this canoe by the natives who were unobserved by us. And so the next day they crept up on our camp and identified who we were, first of all, and then themselves. One group of natives took a message on a little scrap of paper back to Lieutenant Evans, and the other group of natives took a coconut, a green coconut, with a message scratched on there with a knife to our base. We knew that we were going to be rescued. We'd set a watch all night long. Apparently, we were all asleep at the climatic moment when Jack and the PT boat arrived off of our little haven there in the bushes. So they were hollering for us to wake. Finally, we woke up in time to be rescued. We all got back to Rendova the next morning, as I recall, a great celebration there because the people back at the base all thought we were dead.
The citation began for heroism in the rescue of 3 men following the ramming and sinking of his motor torpedo boat. And it ended. His courage, endurance, and excellent leadership contributed to the saving of several lives and was in keeping with the highest tradition of the United States Naval Service. W.F. Halsey, Admiral. Barney Ross, who remembers that night off Lumberry Island in the Solomons so well, still remembers one other thing about John F. Kennedy's Navy career.
He was very proud of his craft, and he always wanted the crew of the 109 to sort of think they were special. I remember he always liked to be first when the boats would have a race in from the patrol after patrol or something like that.
Come in a winner. He had learned that. Second place is no good. By the end of 1943, he could no longer hide from himself or from the Navy doctors a racking back pain and a case of malaria. His weight dropped to 125 pounds. He was shipped home and hospitalized. A Navy friend, James Reed.
I think one of the first things I did when I arrived in Boston was to go up to see him at the Chelsea Hospital. It was just at that time he received the news of his brother's death, which of course was a great blow to him. He was really wrestling at that time with the personal decision as to whether he should go into journalism or go to law school or perhaps even into politics. I think the death of his brother Joe crystallized his thinking to a large extent. I think that was one of the main factors which caused him to decide to go into politics.
Paul Fay.
He got everybody that was associated with him at that time feeling that they had something more to do besides just go back into the family business or go to work 8 or 10 hours a day, whatever it might be, but you had an obligation to make a contribution to your community or to your city or your state or your country if you possibly could.
Dave Powers.
I was sitting in 3-decker in Charlestown in January of 1946, and a knock came on the door. I'd come home from the service and my parents were both dead. And a knock came on the door, and in that neighborhood we tried to save on electricity and probably had a 20-watt bulb out in that hallway. So in the semi-darkness I could see this tall, thin, handsome young man standing there, and he reached out his hand and said, "My name is Jack Kennedy. I am a candidate for Congress. Will you help me?"
He was 28. He had tried journalism for 6 months and rejected it on the grounds that journalism got nothing done. He wanted to do something, and he wanted to do it in Washington. So when James Michael Curley decided to run again for mayor of Boston and give up his congressional seat, John F. Kennedy entered the Democratic primary. So did 9 others, any one of whom seemed to have a better chance. Dave Powers.
When he started off, the pros of the district would think of him as a millionaire's son from Harvard, and they would wonder how he could get longshoremen and freight handlers and truck drivers and people that worked hard for a living to vote for him.
He gathered around himself a group of friends from Harvard, from the service, 9 or 10 of us, and he called us the Junior Brain Trust.
James Reed.
He had Red Fade come all the way from California to work for him, people from New York. All over the country, they sort of gathered round when it was learned that he was thinking of running for the Congress. Quite a tribute to him. There was this overwhelming desire, really, to help him to the best of our abilities, which weren't very great at that time, I can assure you.
So one day a week, I would have him in Charlestown and meet him at the Bellevue as early as 6:30 in the morning.
Dave Powers.
We'd rush over the bridge to Charlestown, and he would stand outside the Charlestown Navy Yard from 7 to 8, shaking thousands of workmen's hands as they went in the gate. And by 8:15, most of them have gone in, and we'd stop for breakfast. And now at 9 o'clock, he would start his street tour, walking up Bunker Hill Street, knocking on every door. In the 3-decker neighborhood, he'd have coffee with the Sullivans and tea with the Doughertys. And when he reached the top floor, Mrs. Murphy would say, "Sit down and have a glass of milk." These Irish mothers, they loved him, and they'd want to fatten him up.
He ignored the warnings of the political pros that he couldn't win. He learned how to campaign by campaigning. He shook hands on every wharf in the district and in every firehouse and barber shop and bar.
We'd stop for lunch, and, he'd have a hamburger and a milkshake, and ready to go again. And he always made you, as tired as you would feel, he made you try harder because he was doing his best all the time. He just climbed more stairs and shook more hands and worked harder than all the rest combined. And when they counted the vote, he had received 42% of the total vote cast.
That was a remarkable winning margin in a 10-man race. And after that primary, his victory in the general election came almost as an anticlimax. He went to Washington in January 1947 as a freshman in the 80th Congress. At 29, he was a congressman with convictions, but he still looked like a college boy. A group of tourists in the House elevator asked him for the 4th floor. Charles Bartlett.
We really had a lot of fun in those days, because we both had the sort of worm's eye view of the whole system. When we first arrived here, we were both young. I think we were rather jealous of our superiors, and we used to sort of snicker about some of the frailties of the leaders and the people that were in the newspapers. And as he got into the Senate in 1952, this was something he put behind him completely. He never really ever again sort of gossiped or really was critical of people. This was not part of the role of the politician. He just put it aside as if he'd never done it.
All his reading, all the endless dinner table debates at home, the classroom work at Harvard, the trips to Europe, the service in the Pacific, he drew on now in the House of Representatives. His friends watched him deepen and mature and become securely and forever his own man. Lord Harlech.
I think that by 1948, which I think was about the first time I saw him directly after the war, it was very noticeable that he'd become more serious-minded, that he was fascinated by world problems. He had, you felt, a feeling that one ought to make a contribution to trying to create a world after the war which was a good deal better than what we'd seen in the 1930s.
At a cocktail party one afternoon, his father was there with him.
Kay Halley.
And his father came up to me and said, "Kay, I wish you could put some pressure on Jack or try to influence him to vote against a certain bill." And I, alas, do not remember what the bill was about. And Jack said he was voting for it. And he said, I'm trying to influence him to vote the other way. And Jack turned and he said, Father, there's one thing we've always decided. He said, you keep out of my politics. I will vote the way I wish to vote, and I am not voting your way. That is finished. And Joe turned to me, the father, and said, well, Kay, that's why I gave them each $1 million, so they could spit in my eye if they wished.
When he ran for re-election to his seat in the House in 1948, he had no competition at all, and none that came close in 1950. He had a safe seat. And no doubt that is part of the reason he gave it up. Charles Bartlett.
I don't think he was ever really stimulated by the House of Representatives. I think the fact that he had no real role to play, that there was no real opportunity for debate. The House members get a minute if they're lucky. I always had the feeling that when he ran against Henry Cabot Lodge in 1952, that he really wanted to get out of the House of Representatives, even if it cost him his public life. He certainly was an odds-on effort against Lodge, but he didn't really care, because I think he felt that the House, for him, had become a waste of time.
James Reed.
I think many people thought he should have run for the governorship of Massachusetts. They felt that Lodge was a very strong candidate, and that possibly Congressman Kennedy at that time wasn't nearly as well known as he would be if he were governor, and then he could run for the Senate. But again, that was typical of him. He decided he'd take the long shot, and he decided to run against Senator Lodge.
Robert Kennedy.
Everybody thought he was going to lose about 1 o'clock at night, because it appeared that all the Democrats were going to lose, and many people left the headquarters then. So there was only a handful left between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. And then at about 5 o'clock, people started to come back in again. Henry Cabot Lodge's headquarters were across the street. And then at 7:15, he came out and sent a telegram, which we received a couple minutes later. So it wasn't until then that we knew that we'd won.
The only Democrat in Massachusetts to survive the Eisenhower landslide that year was John F. Kennedy. In January 1953, he took a seat on the last row of the minority side of the Senate chamber. He ordered that the middle door of his office, the one that led to his constituents, should never be closed. He gave his attention to anybody who was a resident of Massachusetts, and to one who was not. Her name was Jacqueline Bouvier. Charles Bartlett.
I think he rather enjoyed bachelorhood, but after the election, I think that the idea of settling down had more appeal to him than it had ever had. And as soon as he began to think in those terms, why, you could see that he was moving in the direction of the older. Before he got married, we talked about Jackie, and it was obvious that it was on his mind.
It was a rather tough romance because I think he was campaigning or something during the whole thing.
Lemoyne Billings.
I think he had his eye on the Senate or the governorship all during this period, and he was constantly campaigning. I mean, every time he got an opportunity, he was up getting to know the state of Massachusetts.
I was the first to see the potentials of a union between Jacqueline Bouvier and John Kennedy.
Charles Bartlett.
Then when my brother got married in Long Island in 1948, they were both there. They were at different parts of this large outdoor wedding, and it was very hard to get them together. Jacqueline was way over, and I started to bring her across the crowd, through the crowd, and we ran into an old friend of my father's, Gene Tunney, who was a fascinating man, and I introduced them, and Jackie fell into conversation with Mr. Tunney, and I couldn't get her away. So finally, Jack slipped off in his car, and that was the end of that. 2 years later, when my wife and I had just been married, we were living in a small house in Georgetown. We did have them both to dinner, and it was in the early spring. John Kennedy was just gearing up for his race in Massachusetts. Jackie was just about to leave for Europe. I think he was immediately struck by this girl, and I think she represented a variety of qualities that he hadn't run into before in one package.
They were married in Newport, Rhode Island, September 12th, 1953.
Of course, there's a very humorous incident that happened prior to the wedding, in that the stepfather, Mr. Auchincloss, gave the bachelor dinner.
Paul Fay.
We sat down, I guess there were about 18 of us, sat down at this dinner, and I sat next to the senator, and I said, well, the first thing you have to do is you've got to make a toast to the bride, and I said, that's the only drink that you take out of that glass. You've got to throw that glass into the fireplace. And so when the toast came, the senator stood up and he said, to my future bride, Jacqueline Bouvier, drank his toast down and then said, everybody throw your glasses in the fireplace. Well, all 18 crystal glasses went flying into the fireplace and were destroyed. And Mr. Auchincloss just went an ashen gray and called in an almost broken voice to the waiter to bring more glasses for the continuing of the party. And the senator, no sooner were the glasses set on the table and refilled with wine when he stood up on his feet, he said, "I realize this is not the custom, but the love that I hold for Jacqueline Bouvier overcomes me." A second toast to Jacqueline Bouvier. Everybody drank down the wine, and he said, "And into the fireplace with the glasses." Well, as a result of that second toast, the third set of glasses to come back to the table were the typical type of drinking water glass that you get at Healy's 10-cent restaurant.